Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and with the Shaper being on farm status for about a week now, as per the Atlas of Worlds expansion came out a couple weeks ago, something like that, and Shaper being on farm status now, we all know what the items drop look like, and they're all fairly realistic and attainable for, let's just say, the hardcore user of Path of Exile. So I thought I'd go over what I think of the items and basically what you could do with them as far as I can see, just looking at the surface of them without really playing around with it too much or delving too deep myself. Now, as you can see, this here is the Starforge sword, and as soon as I found it, I put it straight on my Spectral Throw character, and it kind of works in that setup. It's just kind of slightly worse than my Dream Feather. You really would have to build around it, but sure, you could Spectral Throw with it. Ideally, I think what you'd do though is build it similarly, exactly as you see here, to what my Series Disfavor Slayer was. You'd build it non-crit, and go with mostly Flicker Strike to kind of clear, maybe Leap Slam, and use Lacerate to basically do the brunt of your damage. So Flicker Strike, same as always, and Lacerate replaces Earthquake for Starforge, essentially. I think that's the most effective way of building around it. You'd still use a Void Heart, you'd probably still have a freaking Totem to do your single targets, and it'd be kind of a worse version of the Earthquake Disfavor, I think, ultimately. Even though Disfavor these days isn't as good because Earthquake did get nerfed, it'd still be somewhat similar, and I think Lacerate would be good in that scenario. You'd need a Void Heart, you'd need to change up the passive tree a bit to kind of enable it. You would of course have a Witchfire Brew Flask these days, which is a bit better, but ultimately I think it's something like that. The other alternative is to build it as an assassin, and I'll show you what I mean right here. After just quickly messing around in the passive tree, it comes up to look something like this. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. At the moment, this is kind of a clusterfuck mess. But essentially, the point would be to go Assassin and scale Noxious Strike, Toxic Delivery, so you deal lots of poison and bleed, and then go over to Deadly Infusion and pair it with 5 power charges, use the Crit Strikes gem, and go very crit centered, and still have the same sort of playstyle. So you'd be using Flicker Strike and Lacerate for all of your clearing, and it should be just sort of a stronger version of the Slayer in terms of DPS, but weaker in terms of survivability. I'm not quite sure how this would work out, but that's the concept and theory. You'll have something like 60 crit in the long run, which isn't great. You'd probably wear a combs, and you'd do quite a substantial amount of bleed and poison damage. Life on the tree doesn't look great. The tree itself just doesn't look great, having to be melee, two-handed, and starting as an assassin. It feels kind of weird, but the sword itself does have 90 life, so that kind of helps. So those would be my two ideas for the sword in general, and that's about it, so I'll move on to the flask. So a Dying Sun flask also drops off of Shaper. It's his second most rare drop, or second rarest drop, and essentially what it does is give you 30% increased area during the flask and 2 additional projectiles during the flask. Roll on reduced charges used doesn't really matter too much. You're just going to want at least break even, so you get at least 2 charges out of it. And right now it costs something like 3.8 to 4 exalts to buy one, so it's not unrealistic to get one, and it can be pretty good in some builds. Now, essentially what you want to do with one of these is sadly go fucking Pathfinder, because yeah, flasks are good and so is Pathfinder. With Pathfinder, little nodes over here, effect of flask nodes that you get throughout your 8 ascendancy points, paired with the witch nodes over here, you do end up having about 50% flask effect, which in the long run gives you more of this. So 30 turns into 45, and 2 can turn into 3 projectiles during flask effect. So far, really good uses that I've heard of or people have come up with are Explosive Arrow. So you no longer need GMP for Explosive Arrow, and it now becomes a single target and hits a lot harder while being AoE. Kinetic Blast is also a pretty good one, and pretty much any projectile skill could be decent with this, though you mostly want to look for ones that sort of use both of these, area and projectiles. So maybe ice shot as well, for example. Whereas spectral throw, for like my build, the Dream Feather spectral throw, does work, but it's not that great. You'd get rid of the GMP and put the flask in, and you'd lose some other flask. And what would happen is you'd just have a few extra projectiles and you'd clear better for trash, but your single target wouldn't really change, so you wouldn't really gain anything out of that. So it is kind of a niche flask, and there are only a few uses, I think, that are really good there. Otherwise, 45% increased area for a Blade Vortex character in your Pathfinder is still really, really strong. You'd probably just put it in for clearing maps and increase your clear speed substantially, but you wouldn't really use it for boss fights. You'd take it out and yeah, it's just a clear speed flask. Can be really strong in certain builds though, definitely. Next up is something I'm currently trying to build around a little bit, and that is the Shaper's Touch gloves. They are the most common drop, I believe. They're currently worth something like 3 chaos. They're basically worthless because they're not that good. I'm not really trying to build around them, I wouldn't say, but I'm trying to shove them into my build. And that is a sort of a dual Rive Claw, Flicker Strike or Reeve Bleed, degeneration sort of build. So you're stacking a fair amount of dexterity, and at the moment I have almost 400. I will have 500 basically when I've fixed up the character, meaning the gloves themselves will give you 120 life, about that, and about 50% melee physical damage, which is basically not too bad, but it's an easy, or not an easy, a nice way of getting extra life on a evasion type character on this side of the passive tree, because that's basically the only use you can have for these gloves. The other stats are completely worthless, I would dare say. Only the life per dexterity and the melee phys per dexterity are really anything you're going to be looking at. And to do anything with that, to have anywhere near 400 or 500 dexterity, it's got to be on this side of the tree. So it's got to be something that uses Lacerate, Reeve, or a Flicker Strike, basically, to get any use out of these gloves. They're really not that good. Ultimately, it's probably better off to even just like drop one of these claws, wear a shield for life, and put on phase breaks for 90 crit multi, because that's going to give you a lot more benefit. But I'm trying to make these work, and they're okay. They give me a bunch of life right now, so that's something at least, as well as some damage. So I wouldn't really recommend using them if you don't desperately want to make use of the new uniques, but that's the use I have for them so far. It's the only real use I can currently see. Lastly, there is the Voidwalker Murder Boots, also a pretty common drop from the Shaper, I think a little less common than the gloves though, and they look pretty fucking useless. So there's these, and they cost something like 5 chaos right now. There's shitloads of them for sale, so get them as many as you want and try corrupting them if you really feel like it. But what they do is just give you some movement speed, some crappy evasion and energy shield, 20% chance to avoid projectiles while phasing, which isn't really terribly useful. Maybe if you're stacking evasion and you've got arrow dancing, then if you're a raider and you're always phased, that would help you to guarantee you're going to avoid its series spears, I guess. That's about it. And then you have phasing if you've killed recently, so that will pretty much perma-phase you while you're mapping, which is somewhat useful, definitely. Projectiles pierce while phasing is supposed to be the main mod here, and that's kind of weird as well. What you would probably do with this, and I may try and use them myself to shoehorn them into a build as well, is probably build a kinetic blast character, so a Wander, which doesn't take any pierce nodes and is only using kinetic blast to clear with. So your main skill is going to be barrage for single target, and your kinetic blast, you don't get any pierce or anything, but your kinetic blast is your AoE ability on a 4-link, for example, and with the pierce you're always going to be phasing, and this will help you clear packs a lot faster on your 4-link, so you don't have to get pierce into your 4-link for that setup or spend any passives for it. Likewise for lightning arrow, something like that. The real turn off on these boots is they don't have any good energy shield and they don't have any life. or resists. So boot slots are quite often a good source of energy shield, life, or resist, and these have none of the above, so they're going to be really hard to shove into a build, and overall I think they're more or less useless and probably appropriately priced at 5 chaos. In any case, that's about it for the Shaper items. Shaper, I do recommend you go ahead and give him a shot if you can. Starforge still probably should bottom out, I think, at around 10 exalts. Shouldn't ever really get much cheaper than that, unless people farm him like crazy and there's far more Starforge than there is demand. But all in all, the drops are more or less like its Zeri. You have one big ticket item here, you have one secondary item like the Disfavor, which still will make you profits, and then you have two more or less garbage items that aren't going to get you anything. Hope you enjoyed my thoughts on these items, and I don't know, leave some of your own in the comments. I'm curious to see if anyone's come up with some better uses for these items. And see you guys next time.